Dear Nina, dear distinguished guests, dear friends, welcome to the University of Oslo, and welcome to the old festive hall, Gamle Festhall, where we had the parliament in the initial years of the Norwegian nation, really. And it gives me great pleasure to be here tonight, of course, together with the distinguished speakers, and in the memory of a scholar that put his lasting mark on an academic field both nationally and internationally abroad. And I'm sure that Arne Næss would have appreciated the topic of this year's symposium immensely. It is very timely to reinvigorate the debate on the relationship between social and environmental justice. We are at present witnessing that this connection between these two is making itself more felt than possibly ever before, I think. And although a lot of people have been lifted out of poverty during the last decade and inequality between nations is in decline, it is well documented, I believe, that income inequality between the citizens of the world and within most nations is on the rise. I also guess it's clear that your birth is a part of your destiny. We know that someone born into poverty often finds it difficult to escape from poverty. Poverty is furthermore linked to poor health, to crime, to low education levels. And if we cite Mother Sustainable Growth, Gro Harlem Brundtland, she said everything is connected to everything. And I think this is the case also here. In addition, I believe that inequality will possibly accelerate due to some of the fast technological and societal developments that we are seeing these days. The digital divide is but one example, and it is found from north to south, from the west to the east, within countries, within cities. And I believe that new measures are needed in order to make knowledge distribution more egalitarian and to enhance diversity. And these complicated challenges we are facing are actually embedded, of course, in the UN Sustainable Development Goals themselves. Working toward them is both politically and morally correct. But at the same time, they harbor large contradictions. For example, we are supposed to end poverty, halt biodiversity loss, and combat climate change, while at the same time aim for sustainable economic growth. It's a challenge. It's difficult. And as we know, we have not been doing that well with regards to nature and climate. Unless we reduce emissions in accordance with the Paris Agreement, the world will continue on a steady path towards a 3 degrees global warming. And this would be devastating, really. We are already losing nature at a record high speed. In May, the UN Biodiversity Panel submitted a report stating that 1 million of the world's species are under threat of extinction. And the main drivers are land use, deforestation, overexploitation, and climate change. And in the wake of such exploitations often lie infringements on the indigenous rights and local communities' ability to live off and manage their own natural resources. Joseph Stiglitz, professor at Columbia and former chief economist at the World Bank, has advocated a widening scope of economics in order to address what has become a multifaceted challenge. As he put it, growth is not just a matter of increasing GDP, it must be sustainable. Growth based on environmental degradation, a debt finance consumption binge, or the exploitation of scarce natural resources without reinvesting proceeds is not sustainable. Growth must also be inclusive. At least a majority of the citizens must, some small challenges here, benefit. And I believe we only need to look towards France and the Yellow Vest to see that there are some changes occurring. The same we can look to the protest linked to motor vehicle taxes in England, Spain, and Bulgaria, and we realize, I believe, that environmental challenges and carbon-cutting measures affecting the individual are becoming linked to the problem of growing social and economic differences. The argument of social injustice was also used by the new anti-toll road toll party that recently impacted the Norwegian political landscape here in Norway. Arne Næss, we are going to celebrate him today. He left behind himself a rich philosophical heritage, tying sustainability with solidarity and justice together. It seems ever clearer, I guess, today that one cannot be achieved without the other. This will not be easy. And this is the topic of today. As a start, I look forward to hearing more about these challenges and also strategies for solving these here today. And I really look forward to the evening. I wish you an interesting evening, a creative evening, as it always is when we come to this occasion. So happy to be here and welcome again.
Eva Joly, the 2019 Arne Næss professor, does not have a conventional CV, as some of you know. Rather, like Arne Næss himself, she's a lady who's definitely accumulated a mythology. Her life has abounded in multiple reinventions, from a modest childhood at Grønnerløkka in the Markveien to a trip to be an au pair in Paris, to become a powerful magistrate and presidential candidate in France, believe it or not, and then to an influential politician in the European Green Party. And I believe that she is actually the first modern female version of a character from the Norwegian fairy tales, Askeladden, who, as we remember, rose from a modest status to the royal top thanks to his imagination, resourcefulness, and having a hotline to nature. Eva, you are the Askeladia of our time. At least this is what... Now, Eva's specialty has been collecting high-profile scarps of environmental and financial villains everywhere, studying the links between socio-environmental degradation, tax evasion, money laundering, and first of all, trying to find out legal ways to prevent it, which isn't easy, as you might imagine. She's worked as an advisor in many countries, from Greece and Iceland to Afghanistan, and in France. She is still remembered, feared, and revered for her legendary investigation of the abuses of the oil multinational Elf Aquitaine, a scandal which shook France's political and financial elites. As if it wasn't enough, she's written several books, the latest being Justice Under Siege and French Uranium. Now, I've been, of course, very, very curious about the French perceptions of this Norwegian-born lady who's become so powerful and so threatening to so many actors in the world. And here what I found in Le Figaro. The Figaro writes, "This woman is like a tea bag. You can't tell how strong she is until you put her in hot water." Now, Eva has been in hot waters all her life, so much so that occasionally she needed bodyguards. Now, today she is going to give us her own reading and diagnosis of the conditions of environmental and social justice today, as well maybe the ways to solve some of the problems of our time. Eva, the floor is yours.
It's an honor for me to be here and to talk to you this evening as the 2019 Arne Næss professor. I want to thank the University of Oslo, the Center for Development and the Environment, and the Arne Næss program for this opportunity, especially Rector Svein Stølen and Professor Nina Witoszek, and also for her funny characterization of me. I love to be the Askeladd. I'm also very proud that Madame Arne Næss is here with us, Kitfei Næss, which established a direct line to him. And I must tell you that I learned philosophy in his books, like nearly all Norwegians did in the 60s. In addition, I would like to thank Professor Saskia Sassen for her presence here this evening. It seems to me that her course of action as a researcher has much in common with what I have intended to do throughout my own career as a practitioner of law, so I'm extremely happy we are able to have this exchange of views. The question mark at the end of my speech title is not to be underestimated. I have worked a lot on these issues and have something to say about them, but I certainly do not have the answers to all the questions they raise, rather a set of findings and thoughts and a set of worries and hopes that I'm always happy to share. So let us do it step by step. First by understanding what we are talking about, then by trying to find our first bit of solution. There is a story I like to use to illustrate what I understand as corruption. It is the story of how what is known today as JP Morgan Chase, one of the most powerful banks in the world, was created. On paper, at first it had nothing to do with money, but with public health and water. Since the company was first officially created to help New York clean its water in order to avoid water-related epidemics at the end of the 18th century. The bank was only a branch of this initial company and supposed to help acquire more money. They actually did not succeed in getting cleaner water, and the outbreak of yellow fever continued, but they did have some success in other parts of their activities, among hundreds of them, shows exactly what this evening is about, how public or common goods can be used in order to serve private interest, which is really at the heart of what we are talking about. The right to live next to the water or to drink it without getting ill should obviously be out of reach of political or economic manipulations and considered for its own value. But in this story, it is nothing but a way to support a transaction, a pretext. It does have a value, but only to that extent. Generally speaking, when you talk about corruption, you talk about somebody paying off somebody else to get something they want. But this is a very narrow window on what I consider as corruption. Corruption is not to be defined by the categories of being legal or illegal. You have legal activities that are corrupting. Some things that are now considered as corruption and forbidden were not seen likewise a few years ago, and what is legal and illegal still may change from one country to another. Distortion of public interest, distortions of the social contract, distortion of natural assets. To me, these are the three forms of what corruption really is. It is not only a moral question, it's a question of biology and physics as well. The word corruption, from an etymological point of view, first referred to a biological and physical degradation, to the decay of what you talked about. It is my conviction that we have to think about corruption in these different meanings, but in the same way, which sounds to me actually quite an Arne Næss way of thinking. Corrupting nature is corrupting what is living. Corrupting the living is corrupting ourselves and our souls. Corrupting ourselves and our souls on an individual level is corrupting society, and all of that reciprocally. So you see, it's a wide notion and not easy to deal with. It is deeply rooted in our habits, social behavior, and history. Look at what Cicero's brother wrote to him 64 before Christus in order to help him in the electoral process. Among other things, he discussed who to best to buy and how to do it. Look at the Catholic Church at the end of the Middle Age. It was deeply corrupted and had habits so completely contrary to its own principle. Luther's theses in 1517 were a reaction to the commerce of indulgences that had been put in place by the hierarchy of the church. In 1517, Machiavelli points out that any prince who wants to keep himself away from corruption has to be absolutely exemplary in everything. Otherwise, there will be disorders without no end. What Luther and Machiavelli said about being exemplary is still correct. How can you have a happy street with happy citizens when the rich and the powerful can do whatever they want, whereas you cannot? This has consequences in very different countries, both undemocratic and democratic, but pointing in different directions. In undemocratic countries, you have more and more demonstrations because of social inequalities and impunity, along with more direct political claims or demands. Think about Russia or China or Hong Kong. Their citizens are taking enormous risk to gain more justice and democracy, while in different countries, the same kind of dissatisfaction towards their own institutions leads to people voting more and more for extremists and populists, from the UK to the US, in Italy, in Spain, in France, in Hungary and Poland, and even here in Norway. This does not say that all democratic or undemocratic institutions are alike, but only to say that liberal democracy is simply not enough in the world where we are living today, because it was imagined and created at a very different time, with different aspirations and different conditions on virtually anything: economy, social and environmental problems, or climate. The world itself seems far less complex than it is today, and our institutions are not equipped in order to properly take care of today's complexity. It is especially true when it comes to the corruption of our economic and political system and of the environment. There is something we have to keep in mind here. The way we deal with corruption, like the way we deal with the environment, cannot be seen as if these two issues had no link with one country's and the world's social organization and situation. For a long time, I thought it to be a good idea to impose some formal conditions or criteria before giving international development aid to a country. International development aid is supposed to help the country on every level, both for its development and for the strengthening of its institutions. But you cannot enforce good institutions from the outside. The institution of a country can only be built by its own people if it is to succeed. Many of these rules and criteria were eventually much less efficient in helping countries to make their institutions stronger than in helping us to have a take in the country's economic interest. Think about Afghanistan. The US troops are about to fully withdraw, and yet there are still hundreds of people dying each week. I know the country quite well. I worked there for about 3 years, going there several weeks every 3 months with the United Nations and independent joint anti-corruption monitoring and evaluation committee. We studied everything in order to understand the risk and vulnerabilities of corruption, but also its causes and consequences. In hospitals, we found drugs disappearing. In prison, we found jailed persons for whom we were not able to locate a proper arrest warrant, or who had done their time and were still in jail. In the army, we found that the soldiers' meal, which supposedly contained a daily calorie count of 6,000, in reality only contained 800. The drugs were not lost, the arrest warrants was not lost, the food was not lost, they had been traded. Rule of law was lost. And with the rule of law missing, speaking about lessening corruption would be nothing but a fantasy. Another example takes us to the Amazon rainforest. Imagine there is a giant corporation there, that pays on people to ease its access to the natural assets of the area. What is worse, the corruption of a few men or the corruption of the land? Who is to blame, the global company and these few men, or first and foremost, the global company? In the end, such actions simply seem to mean that men and nature are in the same way disposable. So to really defend a community's rights begins by recognizing and respecting the place and the environment where they live. And to really defend the place interest is to recognize and respect the community it hosts. NGOs like Global Witness or Frontline Defenders are quite clear on that matter. More and more activists are killed each year because they try to defend the rights of the lands, the environment, and their communities. 3 were murdered because of this each week in 2019, according to Global Witness. The Philippines, Colombia, India, and Brazil were the 4 worst countries in 2018. At the end of this summer, which brought fires like never before in the Amazon rainforest, we must remember how Bolsonaro considers the local communities and the environment as something to get rid of. In 2009, we're going to rip up Raposa Serra do Sol, he said in 2016, about one particular indigenous territory in northern Brazil. And because he wanted to be very clear on what he had in mind, he added, "We are going to give gun to all the ranchers." Of course, this is a disgrace, to say it at least. But it would be too easy to consider the Brazilian officials as the only ones responsible for what is happening, because the world is actually more co-responsible than we like to think. So what is deforestation? It is economy. They hurt a rainforest of global importance because they see an immediate interest in it from an economical point of view. Amazon's deforestation is caused by soybean production in order to feed the world's industrial livestock, or to breed beef cattle instead of the forest, or by mining operations in order to extract precious minerals. And who do we find among the main consumers of these products? Europe, North America, or China? Unless these countries act to change their own way of functioning, I'm afraid it will be difficult to make things change in the Amazon, from Brazil to French Guiana. Maybe we need some of the resources that are found there, but we need the forest itself just as much and even more. A few weeks ago, Intercept wrote an article on the presence in Brazil of a US company named Blackstone, with the exploitation of lands, the construction of a highway, and of a shipping terminal. All of this in the Mato Grosso state, one of the most affected regions by this year's fires. In itself, this piece of information is enough to point out one specific actor with a terrible responsibility for what is happening in the Amazon. Blackstone is not only a big player in agribusiness, it is a major player in global finance, led by a close ally of the most prominent Republicans in the US, like Donald Trump himself, and has a very diverse portfolio which allows it to play at a global scale on a huge variety of sectors, depending on the conjuncture. And you can find it in other countries, in other controversial news. They are, for instance, active in the global crisis, the global housing crisis. And the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, Ms. Lailani Farah, has pointed them out. They are a paramount example of a kind of global actor that may have never existed before and illustrate the challenge we have ahead to us. Too big, too out of control, not enough limits nor accountability for what they do. the COA of this company earned last year $563 million. He is a multi-billionaire, and one of the things we should do is to forbid millionaires. So, in this challenging context, what is our responsibility? What we have to do is simple from an intellectual point of view, but very difficult from a practical one. We have to reconnect the dots that have been disconnected for far too long, and at the same time trace back the limits that seems to have disappeared a long time ago. We act as if it were possible to consider everything independent from one another, the fate of democracy, the fate of economy, the fate of the environment, even our problems, and possibly some of their solutions, seems to come out of the blue. The first are negative externalities in which we are not able to see our own responsibility. The others are some technological miracles that we are waiting for, as if innovation would save us from having to change. We have to get rid of these illusions. We are not gods and not even Prometheus, who, according to the Greek mythology, gave men the secret of making fire. We are not masters of nature, we are part of it. We have to change. The way our societies work today have to change. I consider this extremely difficult, but I do want to think things are not written in stone. At last, think about the way ordinary people are beginning to change their habits, in the way they clothe themselves, in the way they travel. Public awareness, which is maybe the main key to all of this, is growing more and more with a new kind of civic engagement in different dimensions and on every subject, even when it comes to the banking activities, like what happened in Spain to a financial institution created in 2010 in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. Bankia was born by incorporating the activities of 7 different saving banks. It received half of the total amount of the first bailout of the banks in the country, 5 billion out of 10. Last year, its former president, Rodrigo Rato, who had been the IMF managing director and before that, Spanish Minister of Economy, has been sentenced to jail for 4.5 years after it was discovered that dozens of executives had misused the funds of the bank. They actually benefited of the so-called black cards with them. They were able to buy anything and everything, jewels and vacation and whatever, paying with money from the bank's funds. They used this system up to 12 million euros, while Spain was struggling to recover from its crisis. And they did worse. They decided to steal from the savers in the bank. They ruined 300,000 savers, nurses, farmers, teachers, by selling them what they called preferencia. That was bearing, they were told, 7% of interest, but they would only be paid if the bank was beneficial, and it was not. And they were not able to get their savings back. What is interesting here is that the inquiry that led to Rodrigo Rato's conviction was not initiated by the board or by the control authorities. It was initiated by a small group of activists headed by Simona Levi, who is a tango dancerin, who set up a digital platform to crowdsource Bankia's wrongdoings, guaranteeing the source's anonymity. They conducted their own investigation, collecting, for example, a leak of 8,000 emails, which brought light on the bank's executives' action. 3 elements are remarkable here. Firstly, the facts. Quite serious fact and quite representative of other action we have seen in the finance sector. both in Spain and abroad, both deemed legal and illegal. Professor Sassen has said in numerous occasions that finance, contrary to traditional banking, it's not traditional banking, it's like an extractive industry, and I must tell you, I agree. They do not thrive when their clients do, selling money to help them become bigger or develop new projects. They take the value out of other sectors or actors in order to grow their own value, leaving nothing behind. Secondly, the institution's first reaction. They didn't start making inquiry into Bankia. They started making an inquiry into how this civic group had got the information. And that is not because they are corrupt. It is because they don't know what to do. It is too big for them. Go after the bank is too difficult, so they do what they can achieve. And this we see every day. You see it in Portugal today, where the whistleblower of the football leagues, Luis Pinto, he revealed the corruption in the football world. And there is a lot of ongoing inquiries. But Portugal jailed him, and they are not doing anything about what he told, because they have a rule, a stupid rule, saying that they cannot use proofs that has been obtained illegally. So you see, justice systems are not very pertinent, and they are all over the world, understaffed, and lack of competence, lack of money. So, well, thinking about this, you see the citizens that empower themselves. This is beautiful, and it is disturbing. Those militants have faith in what they want and what they do. And they achieve miracles, forcing companies to change their plans, countries to change their laws. But civil society cannot take care of everything by itself. Think about Dr. Thomas Stockmann in Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, maybe the first whistleblower in literature. By all means, he is in the right if you look at the issue itself, but I'm convinced he is in the wrong as well. He is unable to understand other people's concern and to build any kind of coalition around his fight. We certainly have the same kind of problem. We have to change the whole system, but change is not easy to make acceptable from a social point of view. If we stop exploiting natural resources at this insane pace, what do we do for the people who work in that sector? If we decide to change our whole approach to labor or health, how do we finance or take care of our elders? These kind of issues should be taken care of by public authorities. When too much rely on civil society, it can mean that the state is failing and can be fragile, because civil society organizations are easier to circumvent and because it depends ultimately on only a few militants. Worse, when a state appears not to be up to the task, sincere activists are not the only ones to rise up to fix the mess. Big corporations are rarely afar because they have a tendency to fill the void and propose the course of action that fits best their own interest at mind. This new course of action is sometimes better than no course, for a time at least, but it will always be best from a collective point of view when we know that we as citizens have no control at all on a giant actors like the GAFAMs that are not different from other actors in terms of profit seeking. So we, citizens, NGO, countries alike, all have to mobilize ourselves around one fact. The states, regulations, way of life, a lot of us still know are not immortal. They are linked to a period that is now over. So they have to change in order to make the best of the situation, not to undo globalization, but to at least really take it into consideration, not to undo democracy, but to really put it into motion. 3 priorities seem to be pursued in that perspective. They will not be enough to change the world, but are essential to proceed. We have to balance the local, regional, and global scales. And we need more treaties, more international treaties for regulation and not for deregulation. We have had 2 treaties in the recent months, one important and one, I think, less interesting. The first treaty is about the European prosecutor. It will be the first time in history that we will have such an office, somebody that will be able to conduct inquiries throughout Europe on crimes against the financial interest of the EU and VAT frauds. And this will help fight impunity. And in that is an important democratic factor. The bad news is the treaty between the EU and the Mercosur. You remember maybe during the last G20 meeting, G7 meeting in France, where it was presented as a way to oblige the Latin American countries to play by the rules of the Paris Agreement. I do not believe that that is true, because what is underlying in an international commercial treaty is that it will increase the goods that are traded, and it will increase the CO2 emissions. What we have also is to rethink limits. We have forgotten that we are living in a limited world, and that even if it is big and it has shrunk to new transportation and technologies, we were not able to see that the world was limited. We preferred to see that we were able to travel faster and longer than before, and that we are going beyond our limits. It's not that we have not the notion of limits, but we have used them with our way of thinking to create states, to create frontiers, and to create institutions, and to organize social hierarchies. And now we have to rethink the idea of limits in order to stop concentrating on these 2 factors and rather weak notions. And we have to rebuild and protect a kind of equilibrium-based system, simply because we cannot last any longer with a system that does not take into consideration the limitation of its environment. It just cannot work. The ultimate goal is the limitation and reduction of the way we consume energy and natural resources. And because we cannot imagine radically changing our ways of functioning from one day to the other, we have to do it gradually, which is not necessarily contrary quickly, but by targeting the most obvious suspect first. Yes, and as you know, last year, our emission of green gases increased. It increased by 2%. So we are not taking the ways. And we have to act on the way we are taking decisions. We have to act against corruption in the political life. Today, it is possible for corporations and rich individuals to influence the political decisions. They are allowed to pay. And how can we have a consensual decision when the process itself is rigged from the beginning? And we have to fight, I think, the most terrible violation of the social contract, which is tax evasion and avoidance and lack of fiscal transparency. Today, 45% of the multinationals' profits are stuffed in tax havens and 10% of the global GDP. And we know from studies done here in Norway, but also from Global Financial Integrity, that there are illicit money flows out of developing countries of more than $1 trillion. So you see what we are doing, what we are giving as development aid is nothing compared to that. One way to fight this is rather easy, and I'm working on it along with Stiglitz and Thomas Piketty. It is to create a register of assets, a global asset register that should register the real beneficial owner, not only the legal owner. Today, we content ourselves all over the world with the legal owner who is hiding, who is behind. Yes, we have regulations today that protect the environment, sometimes with success in their respective purpose. The EU, for instance, has a strong set of regulation protecting water quality, and the US passed a law in the 70s, which the current government tried to destroy, that is protecting their most iconic endangered species. At that time, you had some philosophers and lawmakers who were working on ideas of ecocide, or the idea of giving nature a stand before court. These ideas didn't prevail, but that don't mean that they were not good. So we have to work on this path and to create a crime of ecocide and to make the institution of legal personality and the recognition of the rights of nature. It would not only de facto reinforce natural assets' legal protection, it would help each of us to be much more directly concerned of its defense. We have to protect the ecosystems, but we are the only ones that talk and can use the language. So we have to let the people living in these areas defend the local ecosystems. I want to quote something that Justice Bill Douglas wrote in 1972 as a dissenting opinion in the Supreme Court. He said, "The river, for example, is the living symbol of all the life it sustains or nourishes. Fish, aquatic insects, water ocells, otter, fishes, deer, elk, bear, and all other animals, including man, who are dependent on it or who enjoy it for its sight, its sound, or its life. The river, as plaintiff, speaks for the ecological unit of life that it is part of." It didn't go through in 1972, but today there is a legal battle in the US. There is a Bill of Rights who want to give a stand to protect the Lake Erie, the most polluted lake of the north of the country. They want to give them a stake. So these ideas are moving forward, and we should help them get through. 2 weeks ago, the American writer Jonathan Franzen wrote a piece in the New Yorker about climate. He entitled, "What if we stop pretending?" with a quite eloquent subtitle, "The climate apocalypse is coming. To prepare for it, we need to admit that we can't prevent it." The piece itself is not exactly optimistic. I'm afraid he is quite right on several of its claims, especially one, "Call me a pessimist or call me a humanist, but I don't see human nature fundamentally changing anytime soon. We have known for years there will be huge changes if we do not change ourselves, and we have not collectively changed, at least not enough." But to me, this piece is not only pessimistic. It calls on summons us to act as never before, to consider any good and positive changes, even small ones, as the way to prepare ourselves for whatever is coming. So we have tools, we have dozens of tools that we can use, and the challenge is tremendous. Our choices of actions are multiple, so take your pick and act. It will be acting already. Take your pick and act, and it will give hope. I will stop simply by referring again to Arne Næss. I'm not particularly an optimist, not for today nor for tomorrow, but I definitely want to be an optimist for the 22nd and even for the many years left of the 21st century. So thank you very much.
Dear friends, I will be introducing Saskia Sassen very briefly. Saskia Sassen, it's a great delight and pleasure to have you with us today. Saskia is a world-renowned scholar, Robert Estlin Professor of Sociology at the University of Columbia, and also the Centennial Visiting Professor at the London School of Economics. I first met her in Jerusalem, of all places, and when I first heard her speaking, I thought, well, she is a kind of a Sherlock Holmes of sociology. She has an eye on things invisible, unsaid, under-researched, and unseen, and she is able to pinpoint them, and that was something very rare. And I think if you read her books, you will see that she's doing precisely that. She's been studying for years the tentacles of international corporations, multinational corporations, vested interests, and the different mutations. I think this is very important, some of them invisible to us, and the ways they corrode both our social and our natural environment. She's the author of many academic classics, such as The Cities in the World Economy, Territory, Authority and Rights, and recently a study I've read, Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy. I warmly recommend this book to all the students and staff at Oslo University and to the lay people who are interested in Sherlock Holmes' discoveries.
Well, thank you very much. I was absolutely so impressed with you, Eva, and it's really an honor for me to be here. The main point that I would like to address is this notion that after World War II, we in the West had a good period. Inequality is always there. But really up to the 1980s, I sort of time it between 1975 and the 1980s, this transformation. And every social class was sort of growing a bit. So there was inequality. But when the poor gain a bit, that's what they record. That's what they experience. And that was positive. It seems to me that we are still thinking that our current period is a continuation of that. It is not. We have experienced, I would argue, a radical rupture with that past period. Now, every country is a bit different, and I'm not familiar with your country and your culture, how you discuss. But in the United States, it's quite remarkable, and I would say in quite a few Latin American countries and also quite a few European countries, that the notion is that we're still living in that post-World War II epoch, you know, when everything was growing and it was good and we were modernizing and I don't know what all. 1975 is a marking moment. I think that is when the rupture happened. We globalized, we deregulated, etc., etc. A whole set of transformations. Now I'm going to confine myself, I've written a lot about all of that, but here because I think Eva covered so much ground, and where are you? I agree with her. I know this is a real problem, isn't it now? But let's see how we handle it, you know, but we have no name for this new epoch. We still keep thinking that we are the same, and we are not. Now, I think European countries really are different. Pace, the UK, huh? Barely European, but they are much closer, let's say, to what the Americas do, which is a bit more brutal than what you see in the continent. Though we have a few countries emerging as with a certain kind of brutality also in Europe, especially in certain parts of Europe. Anyhow, so again, one way of thinking about it is that we have seen a transformation which in a complex system is not necessarily totally visible. Because this is very important. We exist in very complex systems. A complex system can accommodate a foundational transformation without making it all visible, like saying, here, I'm the new queen. No. We have a difficult time. And so I come back to the point that I made earlier, that I think in the early 1970s and then into sort of up to 1980, we undergo this transformation. And this transformation has to do with deregulation, with globalization, globalization in quotation marks, a certain type of globalization. But also, and that is what I really want to address, and Eva already talked about it as well, is the rise of a capability. Now, we tend to think that capability is inevitably a positive term, right? Doesn't capability sound like it's got to be good? No. I'm going to talk about a very negative capability. And that capability has to do very centrally with algorithmic mathematics. In other words, a form of knowledge which is truly admirable. It's the physicists mostly, right? So if you walked into Goldman Sachs before 1975, or maybe also a bit later after that, you had 100 secretaries. Now it's 100 physicists. And I'm not blaming the physicists. They just do the experiment, etc., etc. So what has happened is a capacity via algorithmic mathematics of transforming just about everything. You mentioned, Eva, the famous financier who has been buying properties, etc. And I'm working, with Leila Farhani. Leila Farhani, I recommend the film Push. I don't know how many people have seen that film. Nobody in this room. Try to see it. She is this short, little, beautiful human creature she's right now in, I think in Nairobi. She's been around, at least as far as I can tell, 17 countries, trying to address the housing question. And a key actor in the housing question is this very high level financier. Now, I want to make two little points now. One of them is, why is this super rich financier, Eva gave us the data, why is he interested in buying up big housing complexes in 17 countries, which are basically housing for the poor? Why? Is he a nice guy? No, he's not. We know that. We can't hide it even, it would be. By the way, I am under threat by them. I was visited because I've written some critical stuff. And and now they keep sending me all the good things that he's doing, because he's also donating money especially to extremely rich universities that really don't need it. That's also sort of a brilliant move, I must say. But anyhow, coming back to the story, and I'm going to give you a very concrete instance where I was involved in. So I'm out in the Midwest of the United States, which is a certain type of place. And there are a bunch of truckers, huge trucks, and they're moving huge sheets of metal. This is a story that wound up in Congress in a lawsuit, and they had to So I'm not revealing anything that is not in the public domain. At that point, it was not when I was there, but it now is in the public domain. And so these structures, and so I'm hanging out a bit. I dress differently when I hang out, though I have the same sandals. I forgot my proper shoes. I'm so embarrassed. So I have these sandals that I use when I'm in the field. So anyhow, they say, you know, I don't know what we're doing. We're moving these big sheets, these are huge sheets of metal, from one place to another in huge trucks, you know, like regularly every 2 weeks, whatever it could be. I don't know if you are guessing what this is about. I just give you a second to think. So, what needs to be understood, and it's not sufficiently understood, I think, that it used to be that our economies, I want to put this on to mark the difference. Our economy is sort of you were here, you had the stuff, you sold it, right? That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now we have, yes, this, you have the stuff. Yes, we sell, but what we also have is an intermediate space. And that is a space where a lot of the stuff happens, and which is extremely powerful, dangerous, etc. So what Goldman Sachs was after, and again, this was a lawsuit, it's in the public domain, I'm not revealing anything that is not in the public domain, even if many people may not have seen it, but it's in the public domain. So what Goldman Sachs was doing involved this moment up there, not that moment when you have the metals and you go build it. The builders, I mean, okay, fine, there's a delay, they're used to that. This zone is the zone where the real financializing, etc., where the money, the extraordinary prices, this is where that happens. Now, by having the truckers move the sheets of metal, what did that do? That created in this zone a real anxiety about we are running out of metal. And that would be a crisis for many, many different sectors, many different actors. What that then did in this zone was raise the prices of metal sheets. You got it, right? Understand? So Goldman Sachs was simply cheating. A big cheat, but it was cheating. Now, in that case, so they were taken to court. They had to pay $5.2 billion, which is like, oh, I lost 2 coins, you know, more or less. I mean, you know, it's not. And then they happily went on. Now, this is just one example that really got in the news, so we all know about it, etc. I'm not revealing anything that you don't know. But this is happening a lot. And these big financial firms, above all, want to stay clean, so to speak, and are willing to pay. The other thing that is critical is this in-between zone, because that is where the extraordinary monies that we have now, I wanted to show a bit of that, the level, I mean, we're talking trillions of dollars. When you look at the money that is in circulation in the world, it is much more than all the currencies of all the banks in the world. That of all the countries, I'm sorry, I didn't mean banks. So you say, what are we talking about? And so I wanted to give you a few examples, but let's see. Oh, here, this is all terribly interesting stuff. I wrote it all, okay? So we can move on. I'm going to skip my little theoretical moment, but I just want to say that one issue for me is that we need to start going transversal. We have, I don't know what you think, Eva, about that. We have in the academy accumulated a vast amount of knowledge, but it's silos, and we keep developing the little, and the wrinkles become a little more little thingies. It served us well until about maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago. I feel now that when I see what some of our students are doing in top universities, playing with little things, because gee, he said that and it's wrong. No, we really need to cut across. We need to de-theorize in order to re-theorize, etc., etc. So this is some of that. You know, I put myself at the fuzzy edge of paradigmatic knowledge. I can't exit the paradigm completely, but I can choose to be at the edge of it, sort of, pushing in a slightly different direction. Here are some of these, so the need to actively destabilize stable meanings. What is the economy today? What is poverty today? What is the big firms blah blah today? We really need to interrogate. We're dealing with new types of actors, often still dressed in the clothing of an older economy. I'm also very interested, I don't know what that is, with the question of the territorial. What is territory, Territory is a very interesting term. It's not nation state, it's not, anyhow, so for me, the territory is exiting conventional framings. So when I look at the global economy, I see a set of transactions, interactions, etc., that to some extent are really shaped by cities rather than national sovereigns. The cities have become very active territorialities, if you want, right? And they connect with each other. There are very specialized circuits. I like to argue that, footnote now, in the trading of high finance, for instance, New York, London, Hong Kong, those are sort of partners of sorts, in a way that Chicago, Seoul, Shanghai. When you begin to look at these global circuits, how they get constituted, what are the actors, what are the sectors, you see very, very interesting patterns that are very partial in terms of the countries involved. There's just a bit of country involved, but that involve many other such bits. And these actors often really don't compete with each other very much. This is an important difference. We tend to think they're all competing. Hell no, they're not. So Chicago is a major financial center in the United States. So is, of course, New York. They don't compete with each other. But yet another footnote, if I may, I don't want to lose you all. So even though they don't really transact too much, they do transact a bit. So I'm just going to give you an example of the question of time here, a little footnote. So between Chicago and New York, there is a super cable. That high finance doesn't deal with it's all fiber optic. Huh? They don't touch. The other stuff is for us. So it breaks down. It can be captured. They have their own. Anyhow, so there is this fiber optic cable. Are you still with me, or am I moving too quickly? So that goes from Chicago to New York, because they have some transactions, of course, to do. Now, it is pretty straight until there is a little wrinkle, because there was a rock or who knows what. Huh? And so when it was done 10 years ago or 15, it was fine. Now, no. Now they have spent $1 billion to eliminate that little curve. Why? Because speed of we're not talking seconds, we're talking even much less than that. I mean, this is just extraordinary. The amount of money, that's the point here, that is getting invested in order to achieve, a maximum of this. And of course, you also know that in every financial center, if you check it out, as close by as is possible. For me, the first time I saw it was in Hong Kong. There's a vast, like warehouse full of computers who are just working day and night, day and night, day and night, and with speeds that are just on another level. They're not our kind of speed. It's another. So anyhow, these are all sort of materialities. I'm always very interested in that. But, let me just move on. One way of framing this question, where are we at? I love this notion. What's the steam engine of our epoch? Now, the steam engine didn't change everything, but it changed enough to mark a new history. And this is also another way of saying that complex systems don't change by changing everything. Often, when they change, it's not visible, and I think we are going through a period like that, So we cannot see it with our eyes. If we're not told, if we don't learn, if we're not engaged, we don't see it, we don't know it. I think this is sort of a serious issue. Now, question today, what's the equivalent today of that steam engine of, 200 years ago? That which can make a new ordering, not change everything, but make a new ordering with enough of a change that something foundational happens, even if we cannot see it, even if it is so minor that we don't quite register it, and which can shape what is in and what's out. And believe me, more and more people like us, we're out, okay? Just in case you didn't see that coming. Now here is an example. Here's an example of high finance. So I want you to look at this. So this is less than $1 trillion, right? 201. This is for real. This is not an invented. This captures a reality. And 7 years later, etc., 62 trillion. So from less than $1 trillion to 62 trillion. Now, 62 trillion is more than certain measures of global GDP. I mean, it's a lot. Those 62 trillion, at that point, this is, you understand, this is 2007, 2008, 2008 then the crisis comes. At that point, 62 trillion was just 10%. 10% of the total value of this kind of, very, very complex mathematical blah, blah, blah. So there is a capability in play here that is simply constituted in a novel way. I say novel in the sense that we didn't have it before. I don't know, is it a discovery, is it an innovation? I don't know, but it is constitutive. It's not just, no, it constitutes new capabilities and hence new sort of, partial worlds. Now, second element here we are talking finance now. So the first element was what I just said. Look at this term, dark pools. This is not my language. This dark pools sounds a bit, I don't know how it gets captured in your imagination since you have a different language. But in English, dark pools, it sounds a bit dirty, it sounds a bit, problematic or something like that. That is the language that the head of the Central Bank of the United States, not the current head, which is a Trump appointment, but a very reasonable former professor at Princeton University, etc. When he stepped down, he talked about all kinds of things, blah, blah, blah. And then he said, and then we have the dark, he produced this language, but that language also sort of floating around. He says, and then we have the dark pools. And we don't know what's happening. He said this. When the head of the central bank in the United States steps down, you don't expect him to say, and I don't know what the hell is happening, frankly, And then he said, most trading not as in traitors, though could be that too, but trading, just trading. Most trading happens in these dark pools. And we do not know what is happening there. What are the dark pools? By the way, so in the US, etc., very big, and Europe now has that too. They are private networks, owned, constituted, and controlled by banks, private banks. These are private banks which are financial firms. They are not nice little banks that sell money. This is not about selling money. Selling money is for you and for me, nice little banks. This is about just generating valuations that are almost unimaginable. And so, and he said, we don't know what's happening there, but we know that more and more of whatever we are trading financially happens in these dark pools. Now, I don't know if you understand how weird it is to have the head of a central bank, a professor of finance at Princeton University, bring up the concept of dark pools. It's sort of a surprise. Now, totally different. Third little element, difference. This is a familiar story here in Europe. So we're talking, like, just look at this: Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland. India is in there, hanging in there. But I'm just especially interested in the Europeans. This is when the Eastern Europe, becomes part of the European context. Now, I want you to just a very little comment here. I want you to notice this number. Let's just take Czech Republic or Hungary. Those are the most extreme cases. So you have 2000. There is an 8.5, 11, and then 5 years later, 27, 39. What are we talking about? This is the language, the formal language, which I am a critic of. Ratio of household credit to personal disposable income. Credit sounds like it's something that you get, that you have. Now, why am I interested in this? 5 years, Czech Republic, Hungary, etc., household credit. Okay, first let me say, credit is debt. Credit sounds like it's mine. No, you have a debt. Yeah, you can use it, but you have a debt. So it's a negative of sorts. You understand? It's also a positive if you because whatever. But so we have here a language, credit, rather than debt. I find that problematic. Credit just sounds positive, it's just like something desirable. Now, so 8.5% a year of Czech Republic. The United States was already at 104%, always number one. Huh? The extraordinarily reasonable Germans, 70. What happens in the United States moves fast and is 132 points. In other words, it's super debt. Huh? Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, from 8.5, very reasonable and modest households. Remember that most of the households in these countries at that point are very modest. Up to 27%, Hungary 39%. And so I stand back and I ask myself questions, what's happening up there? I want to know who owns that debt of those modest households. So let's see if I have the right slide here. So here we have the share of foreign currency denominated household credit. You understand that, right? In other words, it's foreign debt. A foreigner owns the debt of those modest households. So I then, of course, want to know, well, who are they? And, oh God, I don't have that slide. Well, they are mostly, these are all, it's foreign banks own the modest debt of those Central European countries that had moved, to the Western mode, if you want. And in the case of Hungary, here, it's, up to 40% is owned by... Now, I then want to know, who are those foreign banks? It turns out, I realize I don't have the slide here, but so those foreign banks are almost all of the banks involved in this particular Eastern European moment. They're all Germanic. It's it's Germany, it's Switzerland, and it's Austria. Exactly, those three. Now, why they are Germanic, I don't know. This is not. But what is interesting is the extent to which those big banks, they're very powerful banks, own the modest, very, very modest debt of these very, very, very modest households. There's something not right there. You understand what I'm saying? Now, you can disagree with me, by the way, but anyhow, in short, just to make it short, extractive sectors can extract even from modest households, because that's what they're doing. They're extracting. That model has now gone viral, I would say. So I want to come back to what Eva mentioned, the bad guy there, he has two lives. One life is, the particular life that I'm tracking, is that he's buying up all these very modest, they're modest housing complexes. It's not units, it's the whole building. Very modest, which in itself is a question. And I'm very curious to see, I'm going to tell you what I think, and then let's see if you agree with me. So that's one kind of issue involved here. And so I had to go digging. I couldn't understand. What are they doing? Is this just really about fixing up houses and then raising the price? I didn't buy that for a second. It seems to me that a critical element that is not sufficiently recognized is that with algorithmic mathematics, I come back to that point, you can transform stuff, the most modest kind of stuff, a chair, my broken shoe, whatever, materialities. You can literally transform it into something that can be sold. Now, it's not sold as my shoe, it's sold as an asset-backed security. Assets, a materiality. So there are two financial modes. One that is for us, derivatives. Stay away. The derivatives ones were good, but the derivatives that have been around for 50 years, some of them, it derives its value from something. What has happened is that you and us, etc., you know, we are stuck with derivatives. Not so desirable right now. The high finance level, they don't do derivatives. They do asset-backed securities. Well, to do an asset-backed security means that you need a materiality. You need something material. Guess what? All those houses, these poor, modest houses, they have two functions. One is, yes, they come, this is the visible moment, they fix them up, and then you pay a bit of a higher rent. But guess what's the other element? The other element is that what you have is a field of assets. And that you can sell to the high investment circuit, this circuit. The house, the little house fixed up, and you pay a bit more rent or whatever, or you can't pay more, that's here. Here is a real action. So you need materialities. Well, housing, Jesus, perfect. And it's all these people, these innocents who don't know how to contest, they don't know what's happening, etc., right? So this is a very nasty move. Now you have to stand back and recognize, wow, what a capability. This is algorithmic mathematics of a very high level. It's financiers, coming back to where I started. So one of the reasons this super, super rich man, whom you described, is going around the world. Why is there so much noise here, anyhow? Am I producing all these noises? Yeah. So it's, you know, for him, this is heaven. Because what we see as a modest housing unit or whatever is actually exists as asset-backed securities, extraordinarily abstract. That gets never mentioned. What gets mentioned is, okay, he raised the prices of the housing, and there's a debate about that, huh? Because that means that the original people who were living in those modest houses, when they come back and the prices have been raised, they can't afford them. So there is a nasty little thing of that. But the more significant element is the interest in the housing is because the high investment circuit says, give me an asset-backed security. No more derivatives. How do you get an asset-backed security? How do you get assets? Anything can work really as an asset, but you have to somehow constitute it as asset. It's not true that any materiality is functioning as an asset. Most materialities are not. So how do you get a materiality to function as an asset? And that's what this housing story is about. Oh, see, I'm already so, you know, I thought, here comes, it sounded like a dangerous approach. Now, I want to conclude. I get carried away a bit. Here is just to create a broader spectrum, another extractive mode, which is something which was an enormous crisis. The numbers are stunning. To make the story very, very short, 14.5 million households I don't know how big your country is, but that's just households. This was in the United States. The same thing is now happening a bit in certain European countries. 14.5 million households thought they had they had signed off on a mortgage that was going to eventually allow them to own a house. It didn't work out that way. They actually were indebted, and of the 16 million that they were asked, just sign the contract, just sign the contract, and they signed. Nothing was asked, nothing was measured, nothing, just signed. So 14.5 million of the 16 million contracts that were signed in a period of about 7 years. In other words, firms were sending battalions. Go to the poor neighborhoods, have them sign. Why? What? Because with that signature, they enabled the house to function as an asset, and they could construct their famous asset-backed securities. We're back to that same story. That is the recurrent story. Now, here's a point that I just want to bring as a footnote. 14.5 million households, that is up to 30 million people. I'm Dutch. That's about the total population of the Netherlands, I think. Maybe not even. But who lost their households. Some of them are still in those houses, but eventually, sooner or later, they have to leave. So that's a lot of people. That was an invisible event. We, not because it wasn't material, but because we cannot see 14.5 million households, which can be, 3 times that in terms of the people. And we just cannot see it. We cannot see it with our eyes. So here is an instrumentality, algorithmic math, that allows this extraordinary, you stand back and you have to admire it. You say, wow. But negatively, there are a lot of positive implementations of all of this, but these are the negatives. Now, the other thing that struck me, because the United States is a huge country, it's much too big. It's just a mistake, to be that big for a country. Russia has the same problem, I would argue, but anyhow, that's another discussion. The United States, it's so big, it's so a bit dismembered. I'm very grateful to that country because, I was sort of a refugee there, etc. But yes, I have to end. But what is to me astounding is the ways in which we're using brilliant capabilities to ultimately produce a lot of negative outcomes. Here are some of these numbers. This instrument has entered Europe. This instrument is brilliant and dangerous. So as you can see, some of these are foreclosures means negatives, you have lost, right? And it goes on and on, I don't have that. But I'm just going to end with this. So this is in the middle of the slide. But the emptying of urban land is the other thing. And 2 little points to conclude. Sand and land. We're out of sand, right? Out of sand that we need to construct these towers. There's a lot of sand. Saudi Arabia has a lot of sand, but it's the wrong sand. They'll make it work eventually. So India has no more sand. India was a key provider, etc. Little item. I just leave that, whatever that means. All kinds of emptyings, all kinds of losses, and vast concentration of wealth. We know that the numbers that we now have are absolutely off the charts. That's where we're at. And there is a lack of reality to some of this, and that gives me a kind of hope that activisms of various kinds, and an activism that can include doing analysis, by professors, etc., but that we need to produce these new narratives. We need to recognize that certain capabilities are brilliant and admirable, but they can go in 2 directions, one negative and one really very positive. There is work to be done, and it's work of a different sort from what we have been doing. I leave you with that. Thank you very much.
it's been a tradition at the Arne Næss Symposium to invite young scholars to somehow address the theme of our event, and in this way to train them in the art of persuasion, polemics, and debate without assassinating their opponent. As is the tradition or common practice in a huge country with which Norway has a northern border. We've chosen a novel format to debate our question today, and the question is, are social rights compatible with environmental rights? Are social rights compatible with environmental rights? That's the main question our debaters are going to address. And now, what is our inspiration? Our inspiration is novel because we decided to steal it from our British journalists. As we know, the UK is a country of things splendid and not so splendid. And they often start with a B, like, for example, the Beatles, Brexit, Boris Johnson Bonaparte, as The Economist calls him, and the BBC. Now, the BBC is the key, my dear friends. We've decided to use the BBC debate or Doha debate to pit against one another two teams. One is going to claim that social and environmental rights are not compatible with one another, and this team is represented by the Peruvian, Canadian, Romanian party. And the other team is going to argue the opposite, that social and environmental rights are compatible. And I would like to give the floor to you, and good luck.
Thank you very much, Nina. So we are here to argue that social and environmental rights are not compatible, neither in theory nor practice. I'm aware that such a premise might not well be received by all of you. I mainly been called an enemy of the people. However, the constraints of our legal, economic, and social systems are too hard to ignore. To begin with, the concept of environmental rights is, to say the least, misleading. Let me ask you, who decides who has rights and to what extent? We do. In fact, the whole rights system, which includes social and environmental rights, has at its very core the protection of human beings. As the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world is in the recognition of the equal rights of all members of the human family. In a normative system where peoples are at the same time the distributors and the enforcers of rights, environmental rights are just an extension of social rights. They are the last normative tool designed to protect human interests and values. Wake up, such an anthropocentric system does not protect nature from human intervention. Let's not forget that the UN has not yet recognized that the human right to a healthy environment at a global level. I challenge my opponents and anyone in this room to find this right in the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement. They cannot. But let me convince you with more examples. Starting with Norway, a country that leads the Human Development Index in almost every aspect: health, education, and employment. However, the flourishing of social rights has kept pace with the growth of the oil and gas industry. Ask yourself, would we be here without the support of the oil industry? I don't think so. This incompatibility is shown clearly in the existence of the government pension fund. Through the oil fund, the well-being and financial wealth of future Norwegian generations are not in the protection of nature, but in the exploitation of nature. Although Norway's $1 trillion fund aims to cut oil and gas investments, the finance minister has stated that oil will still be central to Norway's economy. Thus, the satisfaction of social rights rests on an industry which environmental impacts are mainly negative. So even in Norway, social rights are prioritized over environmental rights. And even in cases when environmental rights are prioritized, they come at the expense of social rights. Let's take a look at the international endeavor of creating natural protected areas. According to the UN, in 2018, there were more than 200,000 protected areas, covering 15% of the land. However, since the 80s, scholars have questioned the paradigm of protecting nature as a pristine entity. Why? Because it has led to massive displacement of indigenous people, native peoples, and peasant communities all around the world. In fact, multiple international agencies came to the conclusion that people living in natural protected areas in countries such as India, China, Nigeria, and Peru are materially worse off and impoverished by the introduction of these projects. How? Well, it is because conservation projects restrict their entitlements and faculties for the disposition of their own natural resources. Furthermore, reports on 225 protected areas found that participation, decision-making, transparency, and mechanisms for dispute resolution scored particularly low in all of them. In conclusion, environmental rights are mostly overrun by social rights. And even when environmental rights seem to be prioritized, they have negative impacts in the social and economic rights of the most vulnerable of us. I think it's time to face the truth. Fighting one set of rights always comes at the expense of the other. Thank you.
I will argue that social and environmental rights are compatible. They are compatible, but they are difficult to attain and uphold within a system that favors unsustainable progress and profit over justice. But this is also why they are necessary. I will demonstrate that social and environmental rights are contrasted, not against each other, but against the mutual opponent of oppressive structures that force us to weigh short-term gains for the few heavier than the long-term interests of us all. In a UN report on human rights and the environment, it is stated that the full enjoyment of human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, and water, depends on the services provided by ecosystems, and that the degradation and loss of biodiversity undermines the ability of human beings to pursue their human rights. Gisela, your argument that the communities within protected areas are worse off is misleading. While some parts of society might benefit from unsustainable extractive practices, degradation of ecosystems is likely to reinforce existing patterns of discrimination of the most vulnerable sectors of society. But development does not depend on this form of extraction. An example is Buen Vivir, the good life movement that started in South America. This movement is concerned with consuming less and developing a sense of the collective. It suggests a form of development that sees social, cultural, environmental, and economic factors as working together, as opposed to separately or in opposition to one another. Arne Næss built his environmental philosophy on the foundation that all living beings have long-term interests in common. This is not merely a philosophical argument. People all over the world are recognizing not only the compatibility, but the dependence of human beings on the rest of nature. A powerful example of this is the global phenomenon of climate change lawsuits initiated by people who recognize that the rights of future generations are being threatened by governments and businesses who are failing to protect them from climate change. Similarly, we are seeing an international movement of students participating in school strikes and demanding action to prevent further global warming and climate change. The dependence of human beings on nature is by no means a new discovery, but it is a truth that is becoming increasingly important to explicitly acknowledge in the face of our current environmental crisis. Humanity has progressed to the point where we have the power to determine not only how we live, but what lives. Philosopher Hans Jonas argues that because of this power, humans have obligations towards future generations and the biosphere. Don't forget, Gisela, in many arenas, we have bestowed rights to both social and environmental systems. And this demonstrates that there is a broad acceptance of these obligations. Our challenge is to enforce them against competing agendas. Although the needs of humans and those of the environment are one and the same, we live in a time where they are being pitted against each other. Not for the benefit of human flourishing, not for the benefit of nature's conservation, but for the benefit of the predatory systems we have heard about today. In sum, social and environmental rights face common enemies. Unless we challenge these enemies and pursue both sets of rights together, we will fail to achieve them both.
There is no such thing as compatibility between social and environmental rights. Erica acknowledges that the neoliberal growth system drives a wedge between social rights and any environmental right. But that doesn't neglect the fact that social rights are prioritized at the expense of the environment, and there's no time left for that to change. Gisela addressed the legal and structural difficulties of social and environmental compatibility, and I'm here to address the elephant in the room, us. Our biggest hurdle is human nature. We are selfish, inconsistent, competitive, and burnt out. That is why the tragedy of the commons is such an apt metaphor for our destroying the environment. Ibsen said it well. When a man has interests of his own to protect, he cannot think of everything. This is not some dramatization of a general truth about ourselves. We are confronted daily with examples to support it. Take the Paris Agreement. The fate of the climate crisis relies on curbing the consumption of the world's biggest GHG emitters, China and the US. And yet they are too busy participating in a game of economic and political chicken to adhere to any climate agreement. Lest we forget, Trump digs coal. And Europe isn't free from critique either. With a focus largely on an indefinite Brexit and Boris Johnson's intention of turning the UK into a tax haven, it becomes hard to envision a UK that's anything more than, at best, apathetic about the environment. Of course, we can't only blame our governments. We citizens know better. We agree that climate change is real, as long as we don't have to build the windmill in our own backyard. And I get it, making change is hard, especially change rooted in deep cultural values. But we can't ignore that a hypocrisy exists in this room of very well-meaning people. What a privilege it is to have the option to skip school for free, to have the option to justify each plane ride we've taken this year. And yet most of us continue to talk about climate change solutions steeped in the same old rhetoric of innovation and growth. In fact, just last week, I got back from Canada, speaking of plane rides, the country I was raised in, where my home province, Ontario, is debating changing its slogan from yours to discover to open for business. Yeah, it really is. At its current pace, it will take Canada 2 centuries to meet its Paris Agreement goal of a 30% reduction in emissions. This doesn't even factor in that oil and gas emissions are going up yearly by 2%. We are in a system where it seems like we must make profit to survive. And in doing so, we are urged to ignore all the side effects. We are not going to change in time because this is the value set we're working with. It's taken centuries to shape these values, and it will take centuries more to reimagine them. Even when we've, as Erica says, broadly accepted environmental rights through lawmaking, impact has been nonetheless abysmal. In a UN report released this year on worldwide environmental policy, 176 countries do have environmental framework laws. 150 have a, quote, right to a healthy environment enshrined in their very constitutions. Yet these laws are often defied, especially by multinational corporations, banks, as we've heard, but not limited to, for some other gain. In other words, there is little incentive and no enforcement to adhere to so-called rights of the environment. I want to bring up that in 2017, Brazil's environmental ministers signed a letter for the rights of nature. It would seem like that hasn't worked out very well for them. The fact that the nonprofit Ocean Policing Sea Shepherd, sometimes called an eco-terrorist group, but that's neither here nor there, exists is indicative of the paltry state of environmental protectionism. It's all fun and games until they sink your illegal fishing vessel. At least they're listening. Are we? The IPCC says we have 11 years to drastically curb emissions to prevent a climate catastrophe. In the words of the Me Too movement, time's up.
Thank you very much.
And thankfully, Chrissy's time is up because she has been corrupting you with just nothing but depressing stories about failure and doom. And Eric and I will have none of that. We are here to argue that there are, in fact, many cases where the rights that defend the dignity of both humans and the environment are being successfully pursued together. And these are the stories that demand your attention. To continue the trend of hashtags, not all business. There is a trend of corporations with a conscience working with civil society to self-enforce rules and metrics that protect the environment and the well-being of people at work. One particular form of this is the benefit corporation. B Corps are required to change their legal statutes, and they make it a legal requirement that managers, workers, suppliers, as well as suppliers, work with people, work to prioritize people and planet, and dare I say it, profit. Another example is Mondragon in Spain, which is the world's biggest workers' cooperative and a highly successful example of a caring form of capitalism. By adopting a humanist business philosophy, they ensure that people at work are empowered and receive good and fair wages. They also lead in adopting sustainable practices and are more competitive because of it, as they're complying with international environmental certifications. Yes, of course. While some CEOs want to do the right thing, we all know that they have competitors who don't. For some, the business of business will always be business. Does this mean we're doomed? No. It means there's work to do. If the rules of our financial and legal systems are not being respected, then we should take after those who are changing the rules of the game. These systems, you see, they are tools that we design to achieve the priorities of our choosing. They do not determine whether we win or lose the game. Only we can do that. And yet my opponents have stressed the limitations of any idea that dares try to make the rights of the environment and people compatible. They have offered us no hope, and no thinking beautifully, and no acting dutifully. So, audience, are you paying attention to what's been working in your town? In my home state of Western Australia, there is a just transitions movement in which people in communities with a shrinking coal industry are working to learn new skills with dignity so that no one is left behind in the green jobs transition. And there are working on country programs which empower indigenous rangers to combine traditional knowledge with modern techniques to protect and care for land and sea. And these are delivering outstanding social, cultural, economic, and environmental outcomes. Yes, these actions are small and local, and arguably that's why they work. Cumulatively, they offer us scalable and far-reaching action towards environmental protection and social protection. Partial solutions solve whole problems. I argue this not as a starry-eyed optimist, but as someone who is paying attention to the evidence. Let me bring some psychology into the room. The dominant framing of doomism that fosters a climate of anxiety and inaction is a problem. Sure, Chrissy is creating a sense of urgency, but it's one that leads us down a road of apathy and insecurity, which she admits perpetuates the problems we've been talking about today. She also neglects that many examples through history demonstrate that change can happen exponentially. Take the classic example of the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894, where it was predicted that London and New York would be 9 foot deep in horse shit. But they solved that problem in 20 years. So if we only have a decade, game on. To conclude, I argue that if we study and support the stories that do work towards the achievement of social and environmental rights as one, we will get somewhere. These reinforce the best of human nature, including our universal values of dignity, collaboration, fairness, and ambition. And it is these that will reconnect the dots that Eva speaks about, and they will make the seemingly incompatible become compatible. Thank you.
Okay. My dear friends, we are almost at the finale of our symposium today, but let me test the mood in the audience. Who is for the pessimist party? Please raise your hands. The social and environmental rights are not compatible. They are in a minority. And who is for the compatibility? The majority. Oh, you're so disgustingly politically correct. Okay, since I am from Poland and I side with heroic losers, I'm going to give a prize, the Arne Næss mini prize, to the heroic losers. The very Arne Næss hat that was given to me by Kid Finesse. And this is the hat Arne wore in the film The Loop. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the film, but it's worth seeing, definitely. I hope to see you next year at an even more splendid and provocative event. Thank you. Thanks.